We're going to start our meeting today with a pledge by Phil Brown, who is appropriately attired. If you want to mute, there you go, Phil.
Absolutely, ready to go. Put your right hand over your heart and repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, Phil. We sure appreciate it. And I'm going to ask Mike Morrissey to give us the thought for the day today.
Yeah, can you hold on a minute? I've got to clear up the flag.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can.
All our dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them. Walt Disney.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Okay. I don't know if Jim Spillman, is he on the call yet today?
If he's not, I can do it, Chris.
Okay, so the raffle rules are everyone on the call, whether you're a guest or a member, is eligible to participate in the raffle. Pick a number between 1,000 and 2,000, write it down or put it in the chat. And at the end of the meeting, we'll do a random drawing with an Excel random number generator and figure out who wins. And you'll, whoever the winner is, will get a $25 check in the mail. So good for you. And thanks a lot. All right. Announcements. So I have one announcement from the Rotary Club of Novato board. We talked about having a in-person meeting outdoors, hopefully in a park if we can convince the city of Novato that that's acceptable. I know most of us are vaccinated, but we still wanted to gauge how comfortable people are in meeting in person. So we expect this would be sometime in early June. And if you are not comfortable, I'm not going to ask you to do that, but if you're not comfortable, just email me and we'll gauge it that way. We don't have as good attendance today as we have in past meetings. I'm not exactly certain why, but maybe more folks will join as we get closer to our speaker. But we'll put that in the bulletin as well. And hopefully we'll be able to get an in-person outdoor meeting before this virtual year ends. So, all right. And then Gloria, you have an announcement if you would unmute.
Okay. Some of you may know I'm now chairing the Environment Sustainability Team, EST, for this club. And so I'm learning a lot, and there's a lot going on to be excited about how different groups and different people are getting involved to save the planet. So what I have for you in a moment is a video from one of the groups called SRAG, and that's the Rotary conglomeration of groups that meets every month and does a lot of stuff. But just prior to that, I want to make sure that you're aware that we're going to have a tree planting at IBC in Novato somewhere between May 3rd and 7th. We can choose the day or days that we want to be involved. I've invited the other Novato Rotary clubs, and sunrise and sunrise evening are definitely involved. And I'm waiting to hear from Ignacio. Hopefully they will join us. And I'm waiting to hear from the interactors. So we could have quite a lot of people in the planting tree mode. Just to know, you don't have to be somebody who lifts things or carries things and does the heavy work. You can do some little things, because I'm not carrying anything heavy and lifting anything, believe me. Okay, so I hope you're interested and will join me. If you are interested, please email me, gloriaviolin@yahoo.com, to let me know you'd like to participate in tree planting. I will send out another way for us to get a list of people, but I really need to know who, unless you've already, and several people have already let me know, unless you already have let me know you want to help plant trees that first week of May, please email me, gloriaviolin@yahoo.com. And now, Mike, go right ahead. We're going to show you a video.
Is it playing?
Yes.
There's no sound at the beginning.
It's the worst humanitarian crisis to hit the region on record.
Wreaking havoc with thousands of locals displaced and in desperate need of aid.
Struggling with severe flooding.
Years, more than 10,000 men, women and children have died trying to cross this stretch of water.
Fires, droughts and all kinds of extreme weather are set to intensify as global temperatures rise.
The UN is cutting its aid operation because donors have promised only half the funding they gave last year.
2020 was the second warmest year on record, coming within 1/100th of a degree of tying the high set by 2016.
Many people imagine there's this untouched wilderness, but the reality is there's really not a lot of wild left out there.
We've converted 75% of the land that is not covered by ice.
Victims of the worst famine we've seen in a century.
That 1 million animal and plant species face extinction.
Faces the world's worst humanitarian crisis.
A tragedy of globally catastrophic proportions.
Battling the worst bushfires in living memory, Australian leaders admit they're in uncharted territory.
We can't pretend that this is something we've experienced before. It's not. The extent and spread of the fires, the speed at which they're going, the way in which they're attacking communities who've never ever seen fire before is unprecedented.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
Fear is mounting for the frozen continent.
Global ice melt has reached a worst-case scenario. A nearly 63% increase from the amount of ice lost annually in the 90s.
The Antarctic ice sheets disappearing at a rate never seen before.
It is worse than expected. This is happening much faster than we've ever seen before.
Today, we are the asteroid that's causing many, many species to go extinct.
Wildlife crime is worsening. 55 African elephants are killed for their ivory every day. That's 20,000 a year.
What happens next is up to every one of us.
In 2014, a United Nations court ordered Japan to immediately stop hunting whales in the Antarctic region.
Station Monroe, this is the Steve Irwin. We strongly advise that you leave these waters immediately. You're in a whale sanctuary. We're going to treat you no differently than illegal poachers.
On a warming planet, millions of protesters today demanded immediate action. It's a protest unique not only for its size, but for those leading it, young activists, many leaving school today to make their point.
In cities all across the world today, protesters are taking to the streets in record numbers, demanding their leaders reduce greenhouse gas emissions to address climate change.
I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to the scientists. And I want you to unite behind the science. And then I want you to take real action.
More than 100 countries enough going carbon neutral.
In Europe, the United States, China,
South Korea,
Japan, Canada,
New Zealand,
the UK will be 100% clean energy economy.
To become the first carbon neutral continent would be carbon neutral.
And is set to go carbon neutral.
Net zero greenhouse gas emissions.
The UK cut carbon emissions further and faster than any other major economy.
The world's largest offshore wind farm.
The scale has transformed. We're now using much bigger turbines. We're now installing much bigger wind farms.
Just one rotation produces enough electricity to power a home for 24 hours.
They float in the winter sunshine. Shimmering islands, silently generating enough power for a small city.
The world's biggest solar array. It would send high-volume direct current 750 kilometres north to the solar battery. The renewable energy would then flow through undersea cables 4,500 kilometres to Singapore.
I want to use my skills and training to protect these animals, to protect this land.
We're going to be up against armed men. They will kill anybody standing in their way.
We started this with 16 women. 240 more women will become rangers in the next 12 months.
We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming whether you like it or not.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Gloria. Gloria had asked that we show that. It doesn't look like it was sponsored by Rotary International. I don't know who it was sponsored by.
It's an SRAG video. Ron, are you here? Ron, can you help me out with this? SRAG.
I'm here, but I don't know who did that video.
It was SRAG at the meeting that I attended the other day online, and they asked if we would show it at our club meetings.
Right.
SRAG, I'll be informing you more as I get to learn more. But it is a Rotary sponsored video, I think.
Thanks, Gloria. All right. Okay, do we have any sunshine report this week? Everybody doing okay? I put a call into Beverly Poole because I hadn't heard from her in a while. Haven't heard back, which is, I think, good news because I asked her if she needed any help to let me know. But it's always good to reach out to members that we haven't seen or heard from in a while. So if you have that opportunity, give a shout out to somebody you haven't seen in a while. All right, so we got a laundry list of birthdays in April. First up, our president-elect, Christina, had a birthday on April 10th. And tell us how you celebrated, Christina.
Well, Brody and I went to Carmel and had a weekend away, which was gorgeous. The weather was stunning. And we actually also got a chance to have a wonderful lunch with Payon and Ron at their Pacific Grove house. So that was kind of fun to be down there to do that as well. So it was a wonderful weekend.
Great.
So thank you.
Okay. And just a reminder that those with birthdays in April, we're going to have a birthday breakfast coming up next Wednesday at Sam's, 9 a.m. Give me a response to the invitation, so I know how many folks are going to come to breakfast, and I can let Sam know as well. So, all right, who else do we have in the audience today that has got a birthday coming up? We have birthday twins, Mike Morrissey and Phil Doherty, coming up on the 21st. You guys are probably going to get together and do something, right? Yeah. Okay, Mike. What do you and Phil have planned?
It's a work in progress.
Okay. Yeah. And Phil, what's your input into that?
Yeah, I'm just waiting for Mike's plans. So
I was waiting for you, Phil.
It sounds like
let's meet over at Finnegan's and we'll figure it out.
We got to invite, we share the birthday with Queen Elizabeth as well. So we get a hold of her. I heard she's free now.
Is she available? All right.
That is something to express a little chagrin about, Phil. I agree. But and Phil, you're gonna head to Hawaii, right, to celebrate your birthday?
Right. Day after the birthday, we're heading for Hawaii for a couple of weeks.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Mike, did you get an invitation or?
I'm waiting.
I'm waiting. Okay. Yeah. All right. I think you're gonna have.
What island are we going to, Phil?
I'll let you know. I'll let you know.
I'm waiting.
Okay. All right. Good. And let's see, who else we had? Moses, you got a birthday coming up at the end of the month, right?
Yeah, well, April is a Jacob's birthday month. Celebrated the oldest boys yesterday, 40.
Oh, wow.
Scallops and chocolate cake cooked by the Miss Judy Keeler. And then we're taking the two of us, or three of us, we'll see, to Enchiladas on the 24th.
Oh, great. Yeah. Do they have outdoor dining at Enchiladas?
They'll have, you can choose either way, but I called a couple of weeks ago just to get in.
Yeah.
But they were at 25% last time I talked to them.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's exciting, you know.
It's a neat place, yeah. Well, we're getting on. Big 71.
Okay.
I'm catching up to Ben.
You got a ways to go.
But, yeah, I'm running.
Good. All right. Well, happy birthday to everybody. I don't know that we have any other birthday folks in the audience today. Let me just take a quick peek. I don't see Suzanne in the audience. Okay, so that was good. Good birthday month, and all you birthday boys and girls, again, let me know if you're interested in going to breakfast next Wednesday. So thanks. So we got a little extra time, and we're going to introduce our speaker. Gary Brayman's going to introduce our speaker. I'm assuming you may want to share the screen, so I've made you a co-host, and you shouldn't have any trouble doing that. So Gary, take it away.
Grace, thank you. Our speaker today is really gotten to be a close friend, just an outstanding guy, real smart, works hard. His name is Neil Leahey, and he's a senior vice president of the 7th largest investment company in the world. It's a French company. Many of us won't know it because it's French, but it's called Amundi. And it's that large. It's the largest company in Europe. So anybody in Europe would certainly know the name. They purchased Pioneer Mutual Funds a few years ago, and that put them into the top 10 worldwide. So it's a great big company. Neil teaches and coaches financial advisors, and he's going to talk about some of the things that he communicates to financial advisors. So he doesn't work with retail customers like you or I, but he helps people learn and grow and give them information that the investment public might like. He lives in Roseville. He graduated from the University of Massachusetts and grew up in New England. He's a good baseball fan, and we have that in common. He's going to talk about the pandemic and how it's made our investing different and how it infects our investments, and about the future concerns that we might have with the pandemic. Neil, thanks so much for coming over. It's just a half hour, 35 minutes probably. So if somebody wanted to ask questions, let's ask them by chat. And then Chris can ask them at the end of the session. because I think you'll have some questions that'll come up. Chris, if we could work it that way, that would be great. Neil, thanks for coming from
Gary,
Roseville, even though you're in your living room.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And, Chris, I'm definitely raising my hand to be out doing this in person. As you can see, I got a face made for radio, so this doesn't always work out for me. Yeah, it'd be great to see everybody. I know a few years back, I think I was invited to one of your Rotary meetings, and I saw a few of you. I recognize a few faces here. So thanks for having me back. I'm not going to go into much detail about who we are at Mundi. As Gary mentioned, we're one of the largest asset managers in the world, and Pioneer Investments, which is our legacy in the United States, is the third oldest mutual fund company in the industry. So we've been around since 1928. So quite a bit of time. Historically, my role with the firm has been to work with our leverage partners, like Frank, Lou, and Gary as a leverage partner. So we kind of bring our intellectual capital, if you will, to the field, to our advisors, so they can articulate that to their clients. As Gary mentioned, we've worked together for many years, and it's my pleasure to do this. So 30 minutes, we're going to talk about the world's problems. Really not a lot of depth that we can go in here. So, maybe under the circumstances, if you guys like what you hear here and we want to do this again, maybe in 6 months, there's just so many moving pieces right now. So many things that are in motion that there's still a lot of guessing games going on. So, can make some forecasts here. The real reason that Gary asked me to do this is because I can predict the future. But so can everybody else. And the guys that get it right don't have to wear a necktie, right? So anyway, take it for what it is. What I plan to do is basically just kind of cover what happened with the pandemic, where we see the opportunities right now in the markets, and some of the headwinds. And then, talk about some of the concerns. It's optimistic. What I'll say right now is a disclaimer. If I mention a company, if I mention a strategy, it is circumstantial. I am no way endorsing that company. I am not making a recommendation. That's why you meet with a financial advisor. I do not work with retail clients. I do not offer investment advice to portfolios. Everybody's got their own set of circumstances, and I will just be using these names as an illustration only. Okay. So, boy, if I was asked to do the quote, I always like to quote baseball quotes. So, and this is for Gary today, Yogi Berra's quote, the future ain't what it used to be, right? So let's talk about what happened and, the situation that we're in right now, because, really, everybody's sort of got, neck problems with just watching these markets over the last year and trying to make heads or tails of what happened. And so a few important things, right? 80% of the US economy is the consumer in this country. The consumer is king in the United States. And when the consumer gets scared and the consumer stops spending money, we go into a recession every time, okay? So you'll hear a lot of people saying this was a medically induced recession, which is true, but in reality, it was a consumer recession that was based on fear. And there was a lot of reason to be afraid. We've referred to these as black swan events. And there's an old saying in our industry, it's the lion in the grass that eats you, right? Not the one that you see out in the savannah. And by definition, this was a black swan event. Nobody was talking about COVID-19 in January of last year. Nobody saw this coming, nor could anyone predict how we as a global economy, central banks around the world, governments around the world will respond to this. And I think a lot of people would be in doubt that you could actually shut down the world's economy for a period of time the way we did. So black swan event. And if you ever get to read Taleb's book about what a black swan is, there's a necessity to it, because by going through these exercises, sometimes you have to touch a hot stove to learn the lesson so that it doesn't happen again. There's an old saying, you don't lose the war for the same reason twice. So often, we'll look and say, hey, what if this happens again? Well, if it happens again, I promise you one thing, it's not going to happen the same way that it happened. There'll be a new set of rules, a new set of circumstances, and probably a new set of knee-jerk reactions. So again, consumer-led recession based on fear. So what happened? Consumers stopped spending money. Businesses get scared. Companies take an axe to their cost structure. They increase their operating leverage. They got lean and mean, right? Everybody was expecting the worst. In fact, in April, unemployment numbers had gotten as high as 14.8%. Now, that's kind of what we were able to calculate with the data that we have. There's many pundits out there that believe that the employment rate was well above 22%. That's a huge number. 20 million Americans lost their jobs during that time period of 4 to 6 weeks. We hadn't seen anything like that before. In fact, during the Depression, unemployment numbers had gotten up to 25%, and that had happened over many years. So as I said, it was a sort of a shell-shocked environment. And there's an old saying is that when the United States sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. Well, this time the United States got the flu. And it's not as dramatic as it used to be. In fact, like that's an old saying. If you go back to 1980, the United States was about 60% of global GDP. Today, we're about 21% of global GDP. So there's been a big flattening. And in fact, if you look at the 40th largest economies in the world, 14 of those, based on GDP, if you stack rank them by GDP, 14 of those are US states. So there's a lot of concentrated, GDP in the United States. You're living in one of those states. Obviously, one of the largest economies in the world. If California was a country itself, it'd be one of the largest economies in the world. So what happened, right? So the government comes galloping in, right? And they injected a lot of money into the system. And in fact, just as a reference, and during the financial crisis in the Obama administration and with Benjamin Bernanke, they injected about 800 billion. We're worried about inflation, okay? Now enter 5 to 6 trillion into the system. These are big numbers. And in fact, how big's a trillion? If you had a count to a trillion, it would take you, if you had an electronic counter, it would take you over 32,000 years to count to a trillion. These are big, big numbers. So there's a lot of pundits out there that are saying, how is this going to be, $6 trillion being injected into a $20 trillion economy? Certainly, this is going to be inflationary. What do we need to worry about? Where is it going to come up? And I want to talk a little bit about that. And John Maynard Keynes, has a quote that says that, stimulus money or quantitative easing needs to be timely, targeted, and temporary, right? So if you have an uncontrolled fire, you want the fire department to show up in a timely manner. You want them to be targeted, put water on the fire, and then when the fire is out, turn the water off, right? Well, they showed up, water's going all over the place. Now it's hitting the fire, but there's no indication that they know when they're going to be able to turn the water off, how much damage the water is going to do, and then who's going to pay the water bill when this is all over and done. So, and one of the things, Gary didn't mention that is in my bio, and not that he would share that in this. In a prior life, I used to be a New York paramedic, and there was a period in my life where I had volunteered in over 65 countries with different, a very interesting video because I had spent a lot of time in a lot of those countries with, a lot of NGOs and companies like Doctors Without Borders. And as a New York paramedic and as an educator in emergency medicine, one of the things you teach your students is about the golden hour, right? So if you get in an accident or you have trauma, your chances of survival go down dramatically after the first 60 minutes if they don't get you to a trauma center, or in reality, that number is to get you into an operating room or to have access to an operating room. So if you consider this, right, you get in an accident, ambulance shows up, they give you pain medication. They get you to the hospital, they get you into surgery, you make it through surgery, you're in recovery, you're on crutches, 6 months later, you're on a cane. Well, when you got in that accident, you needed that pain medication, right? 6 months later, if you're still taking the pain medication, it's probably not about the pain at that point, right? So the United States economy has become addicted to QE. And we've seen this, and this may seem like a long time ago at this point, but the taper tantrum, which we all know, it happened back in 2013 with Benjamin Bernanke. And interestingly enough, that was Jerome Powell's first year as a governor on the board of directors. So he saw the reaction of what politically happened with the taper tantrum when they started to remove some of that stimulus. And removing QE has become the third rail of politics. Nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's very, very unfavorable. And so at some point, the economy is going to have to be on methadone here. And we know that's going to happen. And that's, one of the potential headwinds moving forward. So how did they handle it back then? Well, if anybody's been on a snowmobile, right? If you ever get in trouble on a snowmobile, what you don't do is slow down. Okay, so if you're about to tip into a snowbank, what you do is you kind of gun it. And so if you slow down, you're going to roll over, you're going to sink in the snow. You gun it. The problem with gunning it is you really don't know where you're going, right? At that point, I mean, you could be heading out to open water, you can be heading into a tree, and you run that risk. And this is kind of what happened. So when they had the taper tantrum, they just, instead of dealing with it, injected more money into the system, right? And it all kind of went away. This will be somebody else's concern at some point. So, lo and behold, and I think the reason I'm sharing these stories with you, because one of the biggest concerns you're going to get with what we've done, the modality of it, how we've done it, and a lot of the stimulus money that's been injected in the system is not necessarily all in. It's still coming in 2021. Some of that will be coming in all the way out to 2023. And so you're going to hear more and more about inflation. One of my goals when we have talks like this is that, we talk about some important points. We're kind of protecting you from the overenthusiasm of the media at time, is like what we like to say. But when you are sitting there and you're reading the paper, the Journal, the Financial Times, which is my choice, you'll say, hey, Neil was talking about that. That's something I should pay attention to. That's something that's relevant and pertinent to what's going on. So understanding inflation and how it works is key right now. And, and if you think of it this way, and I've always said inflation's like blood pressure, right? You can't see it, feel it, or touch it. But if it's there and you have it and you don't take care of it, it's going to cause some problems. And it's really the silent killer of a portfolio. And if you ignore it, it can cause major, major problems to your earnings potential, your income later on in retirement. So the best way to understand it, because you'll hear all these different conversations about headline inflation and core inflation and CPI. And the way that I've used to explain it when I taught this was, let's think of it as a very scientific way. Let's think of it as a dog, right? You're watching a dog walk. So imagine the body of the dog is core inflation, okay? And the tail, if we had a very scientific look at the tail from the dog wags, right? It moves from side to side, okay? But if you want to know where the dog's going, don't follow the tail, because the tail's going to throw you off most of the time and make you think the dog's going in an opposite direction. So the tail in this circumstance is headline inflation, which includes food and energy. The body of the dog is core inflation. What you want to watch is the core. That is what should make you nervous or not. I know a lot of people on this call or this Zoom, were adults in the 70s, or maybe young adults in the 70s. They remember what hyperinflation was. As Americans, we don't generally have a lot of reference points to hyperinflation like Europeans do. They look back and they look post-World War I, and they remember people burning money to stay warm. The German Reichmark went from 2 to the US dollar to over 1,500 to 1 overnight. That's one of the reasons why the euro has maintained itself against the US dollar for so long, because they don't have the ability to print money like we do. So when they look in the rearview mirror, they see hyperinflation. We look in our rearview mirror, we see the depression, we see deflation. So a little bit different, in the philosophy. Now, one of the things that, when people say, hey, we looked at the pandemic looks so bad. I mean, we saw the nail salons, the restaurants, people we knew in the service and the travel industry lose their job. It looked like we were going down into a cold, dark abyss. We were. And I think no one really knew how dark that was. And that sort of justified at the time their reasoning of doing everything that they felt was in the best interest of keeping the economy afloat and not sending us back into a depression, which is, again, our rearview mirror in the United States and what we probably fear the most. And when people say, well, I don't understand how it can be as good as it is right now. Think of this. When you look at service, and I mentioned the consumer is the largest piece of the US economy. When you look at entertainment and tourism, the service industry, it really only makes up about 4% of GDP. And everybody's noticed a major housing boom, right? Over the last year, very unexpected, low rates, housing took off. Well, housing's about 15% of US GDP. Energy is another 6%. So with housing and energy kicking up, you really didn't feel the shot in the arm with the 4%. Although, it's tragic. There's so many people that lost their jobs. But when it comes to the economy and it comes to GDP, it might account for why you're seeing so many people spending money that's an area that just didn't affect the equation as much. Not that it's not important. So here's my forecast. And this is what Gary and Lou and Frank want me to share with you. And this is what I get paid to do. Here's my forecast. You ready? Got a pen? The forecast is mostly sunny with a chance of tornadoes. Good enough? Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about right now what we think, where we think the opportunity is, why, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about those tornado warnings because I think they're important too. And I'll say this as a disclaimer. Everybody watches TV. You were watching my TV when we first opened up the Zoom chat. There's a difference between possibilities and probabilities. Okay, anything's possible within the realm of your imagination, but we often fail to put real probabilities on that to say what's the likelihood of an invasion from outer space to come down and do that, right? But we can get caught up on that. We can really get focused on things that are improbable, and down the rabbit hole we go. Okay, so keep that in mind when I talk about those tornado warnings. I'll try to tell you, to what degree of likelihood we're really concerned about that. Does that keep us up at night or not? So the government brought stimulus, the consumer brought its money and its checking account, and science brought the vaccine, right? Now, and I think therein lies probably the most important component of all of this, as far as thinking of the recovery, of how we're going to get out of this, and what things are going to be like for the next 6 to 8 months. It really depends not only on the vaccine, but in our efficacy of rolling it out, it actually working and doing what it's saying, and the economy to get back up, opening. And as I mentioned, this is, welcome to the dress rehearsal, the reopening. Okay, this is what's happening right now. This is where the optimism is coming from. And when I first got into this industry, I was a bond analyst. So you really want to have a conversation that doesn't warm up the room. Get me talking about bonds, okay? But one of the things when you're talking to analysts right now, and you think of the concentration of where the high performers have been over the last year, it's basically been companies that have benefited from the at-home environment. And they're major mega companies that have a global outreach, right? A lot of their labor comes from overseas. They're multinational by nature. And in fact, the concentration was so great in the performance last year that, we saw over 36% of the index was concentrated in the top 5 stocks in the S&P. We haven't seen that. There's a lot of record-breaking sort of little idiosyncrasies that happened last year that were unprecedented. That's one of them. Over 80% of the returns were coming from those top 5 companies. And, we saw a little video. They showed, some of the animals in Africa. If you've ever been on a safari, they talk about the big 5, right? They're hippos, I think the elephants, rhinos, what have you. Somebody it's been on a safari, can answer that. But the big 5 in our industry, they're those FANG stocks. Maybe in throwing Tesla in is where your Apple, your Microsoft, Netflix, and what have you, and Google. So really focused, very, very focused leadership. And that can be a potential headwind moving forward. And I'll explain that as I talk about some of the kind of the headwinds that we're facing. And a good example of thinking about this pent up demand, right? And so as that leadership starts to transfer away from that focus entity that we saw in the index and starts to reward some of the companies that have pent up demand that survive this. And I think that's an important key, right? Because normally when you think of recessions, they're as a result of a business cycle. And again, this was a medically induced recession that we had. But think of a recession this way. Think of a recession as the valley of death, right? And if you were on the other side of the valley and you were watching this happen, what is it that you would see? Well, you'd see a lot of companies go down into the valley of death, some which would never come out again. They would perish in the valley. You'd never see them again. Some companies would come out weakened, right? But they'd still come up on the other side. Some of them would come out stronger than ever. Your Amazons, your Apples, your Facebooks. This is the time in the cycle where the strong pick off the weak. And the complexity of that also is that if this was a ski resort, there would be a big sign across the market right now, experts only. This is not a do-it-yourself, pick your own stock environment. It's a stock picker's environment. There's a lot of potential caveats of just indexing right now or trying to use passive investment. And I'm not saying that as a push for active managers, which we are, but this is really the time in the cycle where the active managers really outperform passive. And I give you a few examples of that. And again, these are just examples, not recommendations. If you're familiar with the company Zimmer Pharmaceutical, they're one of the leading, premier providers of hip and knee replacements. So if anybody's had a hip replacement or knee replacement, they know what I'm talking about. How many hip replacements were done last year? Very little, right? However, if you needed a hip replacement, that need probably didn't go away. And at this point, if you haven't signed up for your hip replacement, you might not get it in 2021. Another example, everybody was worried about, the cruise lines, right? The cruise lines brought COVID, the Princess Cruise Line, with our first death in California was somebody that came off that Princess Cruise. In fact, I live in Rockland, California, and they were not too far from me, that individual that was on that cruise. So Carnival Cruise and Royal Caribbean, and I can't remember which one it was. I think it was Royal Caribbean. They were doing an experimental offering. They were trying to get 2,500 volunteers to take a cruise. They were going to do an Eastern or Western Caribbean so they can kind of practice their pandemic COVID practices, how would they do an actual sailing and adhere to all the regulations. And they were really worried about getting 2,500 people. And they wanted to open up for 2 to 3 weeks to see if they could actually, have this sailing. Within the first day, they had 250,000 people sign up for it. So if that gives you an idea of pent up demand, we are herd animals, right? In situations in the past, not just in the United States, but in other countries that have had lockdowns, that have experienced pandemics, when people get out, they're going to want to travel. I want to go where Gary is right now, wherever that is in the back. I want to be sitting on that beach, having a cocktail with Gary. I've been, getting a little cabin fever over the last year. I think everybody's feeling it. That's going to be an initial rush as we start to see this reopening. Bookings.com, they're like the Expedia in Europe, if you haven't used them before. To them, it doesn't matter if certain hotels went bankrupt because their clients are going to use another hotel. It's not like they're not going to go to Europe because a particular hotel closed down. So there's a lot of potential earnings, and these companies, as a result of last year kind of having a bad zip code, not being in that top 5, are a lot less expensive. So I mentioned that there was a lot of concentration in the large cap growth, those mega cap tech companies. Not only that got really expensive. And, relative to, whether or not there'll be a pullback or whatever, there's pullbacks every year. Every year you can have a 10% pullback. It's happened, since the Depression. Every 4 years, 4 or 5 years, you can have a 15 to 20% pullback. Not uncommon. These are normal. But normally, and again, not making a recommendation, but usually when you see one side of the Eiffel Tower, you get to see the other side at some point as you're looking at a stock chart. So it's something you want to be careful. But at the end of the day, the value of something is not what you think it's worth, it's what somebody's willing to pay for it. So these things can get richer. We've seen it with Tesla, trading at 1,100 times earnings, where, the index is maybe at a 14. And these are just insane valuations right now. Nevertheless, people will continue to put money into it when there's momentum. So, I think the understanding there's going to be winners and losers, and that they're reopening, and that some of that concentrated those positions. It's not that tech's going to implode, but they're not going to grow at the same rate that they did in a real high beta environment like we saw last year. We're thinking that's going to be more on the value side of the equation. More of your financials, more of your cyclicals are going to benefit from the reopening. And to some degree, it might be common sense, right? Is it the utility company? A lot of those companies that benefit from the at-home environment probably aren't going to have the same earnings as they had in 2020. One of the things that's a potential headwinds also for the large cap growth space, and particularly those top 5, is a lot of their labor comes from overseas. So there's increasing costs of labor in China and India. We've seen that, as well as one of the things that as a result of the elections, of course, was a big headwind with a lot of the uncertainty last year as well. But most people are in agreement that taxes are going up. Particularly, we're more worried about corporate taxes. And there's a big proposal to sort of affect the top 100 companies. So that could be a potential headwind for them. If inflation does start to kick in and interest rates start to kick in, that could be another problem. And I think the real issue for a lot of people with trying to figure out whether inflation is going to be there or not is the Federal Reserve going to be too slow to react? Here's my only investment advice that I would give you, and I've learned this of being in this career since the mid 90s, is there's an old saying, don't fight the Fed. And every time you bet against them, 90% of the time you're going to lose. And I think it's not just the Fed, but it's central banks all around the world, whether it's the ECB or the BOJ or the People's Republic of China, People's Bank of China. They've got the biggest hammer in the box. If they want rates at 0, they're at 0. If they want them at 12, they're at 12. So usually don't want to be on the opposite side of that. But nevertheless, people will second guess it. Our forecast for GDP at the end of the year, we're thinking, high single digits, 6% or higher for 2021, and maybe even 5% or higher for 2022. I think the big question right now is that additional stimulus money that comes in, is how is it going to be spent? Will it be spent? Is it in the right hands? And I tell you, the federal government did it all wrong. What they should have done is they should have taken that money and given it to my wife, because that money would have gotten into the system faster than anybody else could have spent it. I promise you that. I know that for a fact. I don't know why they didn't inquire or ask me about that. So that's kind of where we think the opportunity is. And again, it's kind of from 30,000 feet. But let's talk a little bit about the tornado warnings, okay? And I mentioned, again, there's a difference between possibilities and probabilities. One of the biggest ones that I would say to be concerned about is the price of oil. We're really moving towards energy independence in the United States. We've taken a little bit of a step back there. Now that's still something that there's a major vector for that moving forward. I think it's part of the answer of how we get out of this massive deficit that we've created in the money that we borrowed. But the problem with oil, as it relates to the global economy, is oil causes recessions. Even in 2008, if the Lehman thing hadn't happened, we were going to go into a global recession. Early 70s, Yom Kippur War, late 70s, Green Revolution, early 90s, Saddam invades Kuwait. Oil spikes, we go into a recession. So, in a vacuum, the less reliant we are on oil, Middle Eastern oil in particular, the less likely we are to have a global recession. So shooting war in the Middle East, that should catch your attention. There's always a risk of that. And there's a lot of complexities in dealing with that, even now with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, Russia, big commodity linked currency in Russia. There's a lot of countries that would love to see the price of oil go up. The other one I would say, the other big tornado warning out there in Europe is the Ukraine. You're going to be hearing more and more about that. That's something to really pay attention to. And just a little bit of history, if you're not familiar with Ukraine or its relationship to Russia, second largest piece of dirt in Europe, right? I mean, and it's one of the most strategic pieces of land in Europe. I mean, this is where the Russians beat Napoleon. This is where they fought off the Mongolian hordes. This is where they beat Nazi Germany. And if you consider politically that part of the Ukraine, we'll call it the Western half of Ukraine, wants to be more like the EU, they're more Western in their thought, maybe English speaking, versus the eastern part of the Ukraine, more loyal to Russia, Russia speaking. When you think of the EU, it's basically Germany and France and a bunch of dwarfs, right? And the last thing Putin wants is the EU's presence that close to their border. And when people say, well, how do you think about this? Probably one of the easiest ways to think about it is Kiev is a lot closer to Moscow than Cuba was to Washington in the missile crisis. So, pay attention to that one. I think that's something that definitely, these are, again, potential black swans. The fact that we're talking about it probably means it doesn't happen. But if one of these things happen, one of these tornadoes touch down, all bets are off. And then probably the biggest one out there, last year I would have told you it was still, the potential political outcome or what was going to happen with Brexit, because that had been just an absolute roller coaster. I'll talk about roller coasters in a second. But the other is a new variant of the virus, something that comes in untoward, unpredicted, that these vaccines can't get a hold of, and winds up kind of being somewhat of a repeat of what we experienced last year. That's there's just a lot of people on this planet, right? And it's become a lot easier, for a virus to move around the globe. When I was doing most of my work, as I mentioned, overseas in the early 90s, I think the population of the planet was 4.6 billion at the time. And I was doing work in Rwanda, and they thought that was a major global risk at the time. Well, the population's almost doubled since then. So it's a lot easier for a bug to get on a plane and, wherever it is, and jump off in New York City or in San Francisco. So I think that's going to be a continued risk moving forward. And that's, again, all bets are off. Here's what I say. As an investor, and, again, we speak a lot more to our institutional clients, hedge funds, and financial advisors, but I'd been a financial advisor myself. And one of the things I used to always share, with my clients was, I obviously can't see a show of hands, but I'm certain most people on this call have been on a roller coaster, right? I like roller coasters. And, at some point, when you're on that roller coaster, there's always a point where you feel like you're going to die, right? And that's usually when they snap your picture and then they try to sell it back to you in the gift shop when you get off, right? But there's really no inherent risk of dying on that roller coaster, or you never would have got it on, right? However, unless you try to get off that thing while it's moving, then all bets are off, right? Most people would agree on that. But if you keep your seatbelt on and you keep your harness on, you're going to have the ups and downs, but you'll eventually get back to the base. You'll get off, and you'll be safe. But a lot of people, unfortunately, through last year, we've seen this in 2008. We've seen this early 2000s, late 90s, and even in 87. They get off the roller coaster at the bad part. And sometimes it's very difficult to get back on. So this is one of the things that financial advisors, I think, make the biggest impact with their clients is, holding your hand during those times and stopping you from doing things radical. Because had you jumped off in March, you would have watched the train pull away from the station and you never would have seen it again. And, interestingly enough, you see a lot of money coming back into the system right now when we're all at new highs. Today, we hit new highs in the S&P and in the Dow again. So you're all familiar with the Bobby McFerrin song, and I saw Moses had, quite a collection of music there in the background. I'm sure, right? Okay. I get to peek into all of your houses. So, I can tell what you're reading when we're doing it this way. And so you remember the old Bobby McFerrin song? Don't worry, be happy. Yeah, don't worry, be happy. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic right now. The vaccines here, it seems like most people on this call, have been vaccinated. We're going to get out. The economy's reopening. A lot of these companies that went through the valley of death are coming out. They're getting picked up by their competitors, but they're going to survive this. Unemployment numbers are coming down dramatically. We mentioned they got as high up potentially to 22% last year. They're back down to around 6. They were at 3.25 before we went into this. So we're making a tremendous amount of progress. And I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, albeit there's those tornado warnings that are out there. You can't borrow your way into prosperity. We know that inflation could potentially be an issue at some point. We're going to have to pay for this. So there's a lot of different thoughts, around that and strategies around that, but it's not happening today. So for the end of 2021 and most of 2022, I think you're going to see, albeit up and down, again, being on the roller coaster, but I think you're going to see a very positive market environment on the equity side. Fixed income, different story. Bonds have never been able to help you less. This is where you really need a professional when you're working with your bond portfolio. There's a lot of things that are very good out there that are going to work in this environment. There are inflation hedges, but treasuries is one of the worst performing asset class this year. In fact, they've completely given up the hedge that they had last year. So some people refer to treasuries as a bug in search of a windshield right now. So you really have to be careful. This is why you have, find people like, Gary and Frank and Lou to help you and look after your portfolios. So hopefully that was as entertaining as it was informative. I know if we have, I didn't want to go over. So if we had a few minutes, if somebody had a few questions, I'm here. If not, I hope to see everybody in person and do this again sometime, and then be wherever Gary is. I want to be on that lighthouse there in the back on that hill.
We have a couple of questions, Neil. First is from Joy Philman. Joy, did you want to just go ahead and ask the question rather than me read it?
Okay. Yeah, it's not that I know, but I've been looking at the inflation issue a little bit. And so CNN Business talked about that the factors that have kept inflation at bay over the last 20 years still remain alive and well. And your opinion would be valuable on that.
I would say the only concern with that is if they're wrong, there's infinite downside. And so it's better to be prepared for a little bit of inflation. Most pundits and most of the analysts that I work with that aren't selling a product, that are just talking about their concerns and how it affects the products, they're very, very concerned about the velocity of money right now. They're concerned about the pent-up demand and the lack of supply. And this all equals kind of, inflation's a discriminatory thing, right? If you're older, healthcare costs, medication could be a lot more expensive to someone like that than somebody who's in their early 20s, right? So it really depends on your perspective. We think oil will go up. And again, that's going to show up in the tail of the dog, food and energy. If wage inflation, and I think everybody's looking for wage inflation because we really hadn't seen it in the last 10 years. Friedman received the Nobel Prize for coming up with the thesis that, if you pay people not to work, they won't. And in order to get people to come back, you're going to have to pay them a little bit more. So when you have maximum employment, it's the same issue, right? So if I own a restaurant and my cook leaves, how do I get a cook from another restaurant? Well, I have to pay him more than he's making there. And therefore I have to increase the cost of my food, kind of the whole supply chain, supply and demand. And that's why I say inflation's like blood pressure. It kind of creeps in. The beginning stages of inflation are actually intoxicating. And you'll find, going all the way back to every Fed chairman that I've studied, they always make alcohol analogies to this, right? And they say that it's the Fed's job to remove the punch bowl just as the party gets going. And I think that's not a bad analogy right now. And so we're all seeing this. And if you talk to some of the economists, I think this is a great way to think about it. And if we've all been at a college party at some point, it's been a long time for me. But imagine this: it's Friday night, you're at the party, the music's playing, everybody's happy. It looks like the party's going to go on forever, right? But in the back of your mind, that somebody called the cops, right? So at some point, you want to make sure there's not too many people between you and the door.
Okay. So,
and this is kind of where we are in the cycle.
We have another question from Phil Doherty. Phil?
Yeah, Neil, wanted to get your thoughts on cyber currencies. China having released one themselves, and Coinbase, I think, is valued at 100 billion. What's your thought on cyber currencies?
Yeah, I think that when it comes down to things like Bitcoin, hey, Elon Musk's line, you buy a Tesla now with it, right? The younger generation is very keen to it. It can be very, very speculative as well. Bitcoin's not new. I mean, it's been around for a decade. And I think it's with was it the Libra that Facebook was trying to roll out a few years ago, to have some sort of alternative. And so cyber currencies and, basically reserve currencies in the bank are kind of like that anyway, right? So the concept is not new. I think this subject matter comes up more when you see the US dollar depreciating, right? So everybody's made a run at the US dollar as long as it's been king as part of a big hegemon, currency. Can it at some point be, the global currency? It's going to be a long way away. And I think you might see more of like a Chinese currency, or even though they're developing that now themselves. The problem with it is right now it's new, it's interesting, it's speculative, it's very, very volatile, and it can't be used in that fashion on a global standpoint, right? So like if you're in Malaysia and you're going to do business with somebody in South Africa, you don't convert ringgits to rand. You trade in US dollars because it's the most stable currency in the world.
Okay, thanks. So we got a couple other questions. Our time is up at 1:30. So are you willing to stay on for a little bit, Neil?
I've got a few more minutes if
I'm going to close out the meeting, but Moses and Jay have questions. So, but I just wanted to take care of some housekeeping. First is our raffle. Mike, you want to let us know what the winning number is? And Neil, you're eligible to win $25 here. So,
okay, you ready?
Yeah.
The winning number is 1831.
1831. Who's closest? This is on the honor system. Who is it? Marisa?
Yeah, well, I had 1827.
That's, you got it, Marisa. Good job.
My kid's birthday's paid off.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to acknowledge all our guests today. We had 42 screens today, and our guests, Lou Batmali. Thanks, Lou, for joining in. Great to see you. John Rauscher from our Novato Sunrise Club. Duncan McSwain, frequent guest. Good to see you, Duncan. Sadie Remack was here today. Maybe she'll get a piece of that $25. And Roberta Dunham. Those were all of the visitors that I saw today. So thanks a lot for joining in. Next week's meeting, you're going to want to tune in. We've got a change in the speaker. Our planned speaker had to cancel, but Gary's come up with a really great speaker, Reggie Harris, talking about the Living Legacy project through music. It's understanding the civil rights movement through stories and songs. This fella is a teaching artist for the John F. Kennedy Center's CETA program, a Woodrow Wilson Scholar, and the director of music education for the Living Legacy Project. He'll give us a special musical program on race and song, hearing folk songs, songs of pain, songs of the Civil War, the Underground Railroad. So it should be a great program. Invite your friends, and we'll invite the other clubs, but that's coming up next week. So with that, I'm going to adjourn the meeting, but hang on, and Neil will answer the other questions. We have queued up first Moses and then Jay, and our meeting's adjourned.
Thanks, Neil.
Not a question, but being as you're looking into my house, you brought something up. That book on my shelf. And I'll tell you a story. Our own Suzanne Bales booked us to Ireland. And while we're on a flight, I'm reading this book. The volcano in Reykjavik went boom.